I'm Norbert DaCosta, President of the Toronto branch of the World Federalist Movement of Canada. I speak to you from Brampton, Ontario, a part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I welcome you all to today's event. Brampton is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. The dish represents the land, and the spoon represents the peoples of the treaty. The treaty is to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures humans share with it. Importantly, there are no knives to the table, representing that the peoples of the treaty must keep the peace. If you have attended any of our previous Zoom events, you would have heard this land acknowledgement before. Although some might find it repetitive, it serves to remind us that World Federalists, like the participants of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, view the world as one society, embracing all of humanity in all its diversity. We call for urgent progress in developing democratic world institutions, which are essential to assure a peaceful, just, and ecologically sustainable world community. Immediately following this event, approximately 90 minutes from now, some of us, John, myself, and a couple of others, will stay on the Zoom call to answer any questions anybody from the audience may have regarding world federalism and the World Federalist Movement. With that, I pass the mic on to John Cohen to introduce our fantastic speaker, Andreas Bummel. John, over to you.
Thank you, Norbert. Yes, I'm John Cowan, and it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Andreas Bummel, who's our speaker for today. Andreas comes from South Africa, but he's mostly located in Germany when he's not hopping around the world speaking on these matters. He initially studied law and worked in a consultancy firm. Through his time, he has served on the Council of the World Federalist Movement, the international movement, from 1998 to about 2008. By then, he was becoming a full-time activist focused on global governance. He's co-founder and executive director of Democracy Without Borders, and he's the global coordinator of the campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. He's co-authored a couple of books, which you can find out about on any of the websites that will come up if you Google him. As the global coordinator of the UN Parliamentary Assembly, he's clearly the authority on the UNPA that I'm so pleased that he's decided to join us to speak with us today, to help us understand how the people of the world can have a voice in global affairs. So, Andreas, we'll spotlight you and let you proceed. Welcome.
Thank you very much, John and Norbert and the Toronto branch of WFM Canada for the invitation. Of course, it is my pleasure to join you. This is probably mainly a group of the converted. So I believe some of you will already know quite a bit about today's topic, the UN Parliamentary Assembly, and giving a voice to the world's citizens at the global scale. There are different ways to approach the proposal of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. And what I was asked to do today is, for the next 15 to 20 minutes, is first of all to explain what the vision of the UNPA is, how it could possibly be implemented, what is the pathway that we have in mind, and finally, what is the status of the current promotional activities. To start with the vision, I would say that a UN Parliamentary Assembly is a first step and a tool to bring about fair and democratic representation of the world's citizens in a transformed UN and in a global legislative system. This vision has undergone a couple of changes in the course of time. And I need to make a historic remark because the UN Parliamentary Assembly proposal is not new. It has been around ever since the creation of the UN. And the idea of an elected global body that represents global democracy has existed even before the creation of a League of Nations, before the First World War. So the idea of a world parliament, which is essentially the vision behind the UNPA proposal, has been around since the French Revolution. Well, it has been indicated in the invitation to this event also that I have been working on this for a long time. And the International Campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly, in fact, was created in 2007. And the idea was to synergize the efforts for this body on one global platform. And I think the question is valid as to how has the situation changed in the past 15 years, ever since the creation of the UN Parliamentary Assembly, which relates certainly to the question of implementation that I will address also in a moment. I think today we need to see all of this certainly in a context of an ongoing global polycrisis, a term that is more and more used to describe a set of issues that are interrelated and strengthen each other. For instance, the climate crisis, first of all, of course, that is potentially threatening human civilization as we know it. But also, I think we need to emphasize today the return of interstate aggression, namely the war of annexation of Russia against Ukraine, which also brings on the agenda, back on the agenda, the potential threat of nuclear war. Internal violent conflicts that are ongoing, it's over 40 at this stage. Geopolitical tensions and a potential new Cold War that is emerging right now, which includes also tensions with China. A trend of autocratization and nationalist populism in a what I would so-called post-truth world based on extreme relativism, you know, nuclear proliferation that is ongoing and modernization of nuclear arsenals of the great powers, increasing inequality, human rights violations all around that are not stopped. And of course, from the backdrop of a global pandemic that is still ongoing, I would say. And all of this combined, certainly, experts agree, is threatening the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, which includes goals such as abolishing extreme poverty, etc. So I'm talking to a group of world federalists primarily, I believe. All of this will not be new to you at a high level of abstraction if I say that the UN is not fit for purpose. And the global governance system is obviously failing in achieving a just, sustainable, and fair world for all. And the root cause, as world federalists, I'm a world federalist as well, as John has pointed out, is certainly nationalism, but also the interstate system that nationalism brings about and that the UN is based on, which is embodied by the principle of sovereignty, which is still governing interstate relations. And this also means that there is no way for the UN to set world law, binding world law, or to enforce any of the principles and rules that have been established over time that actually already exist in international law, including, for instance, the outlaw of war and interstate aggression. You know, since the Nuremberg trials and Briand-Kellogg Pact before that, it is quite clear that this is a breach of international law that requires even criminal accountability. But how can that be enforced? As World Federalists, we know that only a few advancements in international law have been achieved over the last decades, and primarily the International Criminal Court, which is supposed to hold individuals accountable for the worst crimes possible, genocide, war crimes, but also the war of aggression, which is a bit complicated at the technical level in terms of jurisdiction. Nonetheless, it has been a first step. And now the vision of the UN Parliamentary Assembly is addressing this root cause that we World Federalists have identified, namely the idea that our world actually legally and politically consists exclusively of governments and interstate relations between these governments, and to be more precise, between the executive branches of these governments, and no rules actually can bind them except if they voluntarily submit to them. Now, how does the UN Parliamentary Assembly's vision address this? It's because it embodies the idea that we as individuals, as citizens, we have a political voice at the global scale. And I would say in a more modern view, we have a right to democracy as individuals through the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the International Pact on Political Rights, Convenant. And this right to democracy, it actually also includes the conduct of public affairs beyond the nation state. So I would say that a UN Parliamentary Assembly embodies the implementation of such a right to democracy at the UN and the global scale. And it is supposed to give a voice to the people, but not the people in the sense of them belonging to a particular nation state, but voicing the interest of humanity as a whole, something that the UN, by its structure and definition, is unable to do. So how do we come to implement this vision? And I'm also looking forward to the Q&A, which we will have after this brief initial presentation, where you can address some of your questions. This approach is based on, first of all, the insight that from the perspective of international law, a UN Parliamentary Assembly could be established tomorrow. But the key element is to look at the UNPA as a process. So it would start as a consultative, as a pragmatic body that has no distinctive rights, perhaps, in terms of creating world law, for instance. It would be based on a membership composed of national parliamentarians, also for pragmatic reasons, and be established as a subsidiary body of the UN General Assembly. All of this might sound to the uninitiated very technical, but it is quite important because if the political will existed, that is the bottom line, a majority of the world's states could establish this body tomorrow within the framework of the UN. So we would, for the first time, have a body in the UN setting that is based on elected representatives that are not belonging to the executive branch. Now, looking at it as a process means that this would only be the initial stage on a path of empowering this first body of, this first emanation of the UN Parliamentary Assembly. Over time, the idea is that the UN Parliamentary Assembly would gain rights and functions in the system and become a tool also of transforming the UN itself. So it is not only an end in itself, but it is also the idea that the Parliamentary Assembly, with the progressive members that are included in it, would work towards transforming the UN and towards strengthening the UN and towards strengthening democracy and countering some of the trends I mentioned, like autocratization. Because one of the key features of the UN Parliamentary Assembly from the beginning would be that minorities and opposition parliamentarians would be included, as opposed to the fact that at this moment, even in democracies, those who have not elected governing parties, they are not represented in international affairs at all. Let's not even speak about countries that per se have an autocratic government and governments that do not even represent any of their people in a legitimate way. So if we look at it as a process, the idea is that over time, once a window of opportunity comes up, which we don't know when and how it will, the UNPA is in place and in a position to be transformed into a main body of the UN. And the vision here again is one of a two-chamber system. And none of what I said is actually any of my own ideas, right? This has been around for a long time. And the vision of a two-chamber world parliament, for instance, has been supported by the first Czech president, Václav Havel, at the Millennium Summit in the year 2000, or by philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And the idea is here that we would actually institutionalize the idea of a two-pillar global social contract, a new global social contract, a term that is also being used by Antonio Guterres at this time in some of his reports and speeches. And this, but he has something different in mind institutionally, for sure, rather nothing. But in our case, what we are talking about is one pillar of this global new social contract being based on states, because we accept that nation states, in this concept, nation states continue to play an important role in political, administrative, and other ways, also as a point of identity for many people, which is fine. And the second pillar is really a global, citizens, global citizens as such, who have distinct global rights and responsibilities that are not intermediated by states, the first pillar. Well, and the obvious political manifestation of this would be then this two-chamber system, one like today's UN General Assembly with the executive branches of member states there, right? And the second branch, a directly elected house, like a House of Commons, and the other body more similar to a Senate in domestic terms. So the implementation legally at the first stage is rather easy. Of course, the biggest problem, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is the political side of it, how to get it politically established. And certainly, as I have indicated at the beginning, the conditions have worsened dramatically over the past 15 years while the UNPA campaign has existed, which is unfortunate to take, to acknowledge, but it's a fact that with autocratization going on, democracies are on the retreat and in defensive mode. The global polycrisis has not, in my assessment, yet mobilized global citizens for, a planetary consciousness and a global political movement. Of course, we have the green environmental movement that is stronger and stronger, but it is essentially not addressing the question of global system change in the way of political institutions. So one would have thought that a global pandemic, and you can look at literature before 2020, that a global pandemic with millions of deaths and victims and infected and disrupting the economy globally and so on, that such a pandemic could have helped spark a global consciousness and yes, in fact, a world federalist mass movement, but it hasn't. I think we have to acknowledge that in a very sober and realistic way. quite the contrary. What we have seen in the connection with, nationalist populism is really vaccine nationalism. Every country at first tried to solve this on their own, closing borders, etc. So the question then, of course, is under what circumstances is it realistic to assume that governments at the UN will, and a majority of governments at the UN will accept creating a body like a UN Parliamentary Assembly that is questioning the fundamental power politics of the UN and the international system, and that is embodying in a symbolic way, even at the first stage, the idea of a global democracy that is capable of addressing, for instance, the climate crisis, because it can, in a legitimate way, adopt binding world law. And at this stage, well, many governments, they would stay away from this completely. Nonetheless, I would say also, insofar democracies are concerned, I believe most governments, they have not, even now, after a long time of the existence of this proposal, and governments, they come and go, the diplomats come and go, that's part of the problem. So often, we have to start from scratch all over again and again and again. So even if the campaign has existed for 15 years, we have to start from scratch in many countries all the time politically. And one recent example is Malaysia, where in November last year, the Malaysian foreign minister endorsed a UN Parliamentary Assembly after being involved with us and attending one of our events in New York. Well, and then a snap election was called in Malaysia, and 4 weeks later, he was no longer foreign minister. So that is the real situation we are dealing with, and which means we need to wait for a congregation of good circumstances, which are to a large degree outside of our control. However, having said that, in democracies, the point I wanted to make is that even if a government is skeptical or not ready to take action, they would change their mind and their position from one day to the next immediately if they get a feeling that voters care about it, right? So I see really the game changer in all this. What we are doing is that at some point we manage to make it visible bottom up, right? From a grassroots level up, make it visible that voters in democracies care about changing the global system and that they endorse a UN Parliamentary Assembly as a tool to achieve it, right? And then I am sure, right, if that was visible in, in many ways, part of the climate movement, for instance, and other movements that exist against equality and so on, I think it would gain traction quite quickly, and we would get the support of a few governments that we need to get it, off the ground at the UN, because that it is really, we only need a couple of credible governments, like from Canada, right? And Canada has a tradition of being at least sympathetic, right? Canada, also the UN mission, has co-hosted 2 of our meetings before the pandemic, where we discussed the issue, and we had the meetings in the Canadian UN embassy, in the mission in New York, and so on. So I think that's also why I'm very happy, that you called this meeting here. I think that Canada potentially could really pioneer this cause based on what I just said. It will not be sufficient to write letters, to officials. We've done that a million times, and sometimes, it is a step forward, but it will not necessarily bring about the breakthrough that we require. Well, so I also promised to say a few about the status of current promotional activities, which I will do in the last few minutes, perhaps, and then I will finish and look forward to your questions. You might have lots of them. So I think the most important development was that in 2020, now 3 years ago, we we, that is a group of civil society organizations, Democracy Without Borders, Civicus, Democracy International, we launched what we call the We the People's campaign. At first, it was a call for inclusive global governance in connection with the UN 75th anniversary and a report to be drawn up by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the time, which is called Our Common Agenda. And we launched this campaign to feed civil society views into this UN 75 process, Our Common Agenda, and so on, which is now the process towards the UN Summit of the Future in 2024. So, you know, this process is going on, you know, in eternity. It's changing its names and formats and so on and so forth. And there are consultations all the time, right? So there's now a high-level advisory board of the Secretary General that has done a consultation again last autumn and so on and so forth. But what is really new is the We the People's campaign is a new platform, and it has been now supported by over 220 civil society organizations. And for the first time, we really managed to get real big players endorse this platform, which is not only the UN Parliamentary Assembly, but includes two other proposals as well, one of which is the instrument of a World Citizens Initiative, and the other is the creation of a UN high-level civil society envoy. So we have put three widely supported proposals on one platform, and this kind of helped us see groups, okay, this, you know, as a whole, it makes sense. And we have Greenpeace on board, we have Avaz on board, the Nature Conservancy, one of the largest environmental groups in terms of budget on the planet, and many others, the Coalition for the UN We Need, or, you know, you can look it up at wethepeoples.org. The list is quite good. And this has certainly also now taken center stage in the advocacy for UN Parliamentary Assembly. It turns out to be more appealing or more interesting if we present the proposal, not always, but in a general sense, in connection with other possible steps that could be taken, right? And we are now pushing the We the People's campaign in connection with the Summit of the Future. And in March, just so you know, there will be a Global Futures Forum in New York. New York is not too far away from you, I would say, globally speaking. So it is an opportunity for you, if you can do it, to gather first-hand experience on how this is moving forward. There's a broad spectrum of things that the Global Futures Forum of Civil Society will deal with, but there's one track on UN and global governance innovation, which will also address the people's proposals. So let me finish here, but with one piece of promotion, perhaps. We published a new book, which is called, now it's blurred, Global Democracy, The Key to Global Justice, which is based on YouTube lectures by Odette Gilad and Dana Freeman. And it's very inexpensive. You can get it at all online bookstores. And it is really a very good book that is looking at this vision of global democracy, of which the UN Parliamentary Assembly is part of. Thank you. There's lots more that could be said about the design of the UNPA, allocation of seats, but I trust that if you are interested in these technicalities, which are actually very important, that we can address it in the question and answers section. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andreas. That was a really wonderful 30-minute quick overview of all of the wonderful things your campaign is advocating for. I want to start the question off. This one comes from Rose Dyson, but it's also a mix of my first question. You mentioned obstacles to the development of a UNPA, interstate aggression, rise of authoritarianism, and also extreme relativism. Can you expand on what you mean by that? And my mixed question is, what do you feel to be the most significant barrier to the implementation of a UNPA?
Should I address it right away, or would you like to collect questions? But I think right away is perhaps better.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I risk
address it right away. There's quite a few questions you've stirred up some interesting dialogue. So we'll have lots to chat about.
Yeah, I can see in the chat box while I was speaking, and still now I'm unable to read them. So I trust that you can bring them forward, please, in this Q&A session. Well, so what is the biggest obstacle towards UN Parliamentary Assembly? There are many, but I would say the biggest obstacle is at a mental and ideological level, at a very deep level, where even progressive people who believe in democracy and inclusion, representation, they don't necessarily are able to grasp the idea of a world that is not based on interstate relations, right? So the idea of intergovernmentalism is deeply ingrained in mainstream thinking, in academia, in political sciences, in international relations, scholarship, and in the mainstream as well. So I think in terms of promoting the UN Parliamentary Assembly, we're really addressing this deeply ingrained thinking that, or lack of imagination that anything else is possible than a world of nation states, right? But then again, at the other level, I believe the biggest obstacle is also, and that is actually being said by some, the biggest obstacle is that there is a perceived majority of undemocratic states at the UN, and many don't trust them, rightfully so, and they think that building a democratic body like a UNPA within an organization like the UN, where there are so many autocracies, is building tension and is a contradiction in itself. Right, so many democratic governments, at least in terms of personal opinion of diplomats, would actually say this, right? That they don't know how this tension can be overcome. I can elaborate on what we think about this. Should I?
I want to move to the next question.
Right.
I think that you've actually dipped into a few of the other really interesting questions in the chat. I do want to move to Virginia Swain's question, if you want to unmute, Virginia.
Thank you very much. I noticed Douglas Roach is here. Douglas, hello. I'm very aware of your amazing work with the Middle Powers Initiative. I was wondering if you would speak to that. First of all, let us know what the state of that is right now, and if there's any future potential for that in terms of Andreas's initiative.
May I respond to this question? I didn't actually come to this meeting prepared to speak. I came to hear Andreas Bummel, and I would like to congratulate him warmly on his address a few minutes ago. It was excellent. And it's a representation of the long-standing contribution that he has made to the concept, advancing the concept of a parliamentary assembly, which I, as a former parliamentarian, 100% endorse. Like him, I have concerns about the tensions in the international order today, which have crippled the work of the United Nations as a foremost center for global activity. Now, you asked me specifically about the Middle Powers Initiative. Well, it never actually stopped in the sense of that as an idea. The work of the Middle Powers Initiative was truncated about 10 years ago, when some changes were made, but also the climate for nuclear disarmament not only deteriorated, but governments themselves lost enthusiasm for trying to push nuclear disarmament. And we have seen the result of that through the NPT, failing processes of the NPT, and then correspondingly the assent of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and the the growing community of work that has fostered. Finally, on the question of the World Parliamentary Assembly, the Ukraine war has undoubtedly set back the idea and the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals and related matters designed to bring an advancement in global cooperation. And at the present moment, the Ukraine war has devolved into a de facto war, a proxy war of the West against Russia, which this is going to be a further setback in trying to bring the international community together. So I don't want to conclude these brief remarks on a totally negative view, because I do think that more exertion by the Secretary General in causing there to be an international meeting designed to resolve the Ukraine war is urgently needed, and that needs to be done to clear the way for progress through that. His new agenda for peace is undoubtedly designed to achieve. I eagerly await the new agenda for peace, but it will have to be introduced into a world community that recognizes that the Ukraine war has in some way ended, which would then allow us to move forward.
Thank you for your comments, Douglas, and thank you, Virginia, for your question. I realize there's a lot of intersection between the campaigns we advocate for and our causes here, so I appreciate your comments. Andreas, did you have any comment on anything just said now? Or shall we proceed to the next question?
Well, in the interest of those who came forward with the question, I guess we can move forward, but I can then later address some of the items.
Wonderful.
No.
Our next question comes from the chat. What would the influence on the international developments of the private sector, the next to the influence of the executive branch of the national governments, how could such a private sector influence be democratized as well? Or is this something that's later in the process?
Well, personally, I'm speaking based on my personal opinion. I don't think that my organization or the UNPA campaign has an official view on this. Personally, I'm very skeptical of business inclusion in governance arrangements, if that is the question, because I don't think they have the legitimacy to be involved at that, on par with, for instance, elected representatives. Because I'm saying this because there are proposals around that they should be brought more closely into the system. But I think we see this, for instance, with the Codex Alimentarius Commission, where we have world-leading conglomerates like Nestle and others sitting at the table and making rules on ingredients of food and genetically modified food and so on, and that's then transposed indirectly international law. I'm skeptical about all of this. I think rather that the business sector needs to be submitted to international rules in a quite strong manner, which is not the case now. And well, in making those rules, the business sector, as anyone else, has the opportunity to make their voices and their views heard, right? For instance, in a parliamentary process and connection with hearings and hearing their expertise. That is, I think, a standard way to do it. But I don't see how they would have a stronger seat at the table.
Thank you for that response. This question is also from the chat. It comes from John Cowan. And I think it speaks to something that's very pertinent to a lot of points you brought up, but mainly the idea that success for the campaign is often related to the people who are occupying seats of power. So you mentioned you had someone willing to advocate and quickly they were removed from their position of power. And these are setbacks. So what might the window of opportunity look like that brings a UNPA into existence? Or is it sort of going to field challenges like this regardless?
Well, it is possible to imagine scenarios, but it's just that, scenarios, because I think it is difficult to anticipate how exactly things will play out. But if we look into the past, we can see that many events, also positive ones, happened unexpectedly. So I think the key to success really on our part is preparedness and persistence. And one scenario, for instance, that I find interesting, and which doesn't mean it is likely, but it is a scenario, is the demise of the power of the Chinese Communist Party. I thought that the blank paper protests in November were quite interesting, which erupted completely unexpectedly and under harsh conditions of suppression. So I would say that the spark of democracy hasn't, despite all effort, hasn't been entirely eradicated in China yet, mainland China. So imagine a scenario where the Chinese Communist Party actually loses power and a real multi-party democratic system, arises in China. What a geopolitical game changer that would be. Instantly 1.2 or 1.3 billion people would be under a democratic government. And then this argument, which is often just an excuse, the argument, yes, we cannot create a parliamentary assembly because, there are so much autocratic countries influencing the UN and so on and so forth. That argument would kind of break together. And the same scenario, which sadly is also, I guess, quite unlikely, is with regard to Russia, right? Imagine a post-Putin democratic Russia, who knows whenever that will happen, but that would also be a geopolitical game changer. Just a scenario.
Right.
And one more scenario is, of course, a massive global calamity, but I don't believe that that scenario opens the window of opportunity. Many do. Many world federalists think a third world war may, pave the ground in a dramatic, tragic way, of course, for something new. I don't think that's a realistic scenario, because after such a catastrophe, nothing would be left, really, that could be integrated.
Right. There's also other powers that step in when there is such a crisis. We do have someone who dropped a Milton Friedman quote, speaking of exactly that final possibility of crisis being the impetus behind change. And right after that is a question from Blair Rourke, related exactly to what you were just saying. Do you rule out representation in the PA for all people in the world who live under autocratic government? This is one of the challenges, but would this be a larger part of the world that would go unrepresented in a UNPA?
Yes, well, I mean, we have had, as you can imagine, years of discussion, and not only, so controversial discussions about this. And at Democracy Without Borders and the UNPA campaign, we have come to the conclusion as of now, for the time being, let's say, that we believe the principle of universality is more important than the principle of democracy, meaning that, governments, they accept dealing with each other irrespective of government type. Now, we believe that universality in this sense is important even for a parliamentary assembly, because it makes no sense to have a discussion about climate change, for instance, and then exclude China. Even if these Chinese delegates, everybody would know it, are essentially not parliamentarians, but delegates of the government. But we still think that is important to have an inclusive approach. And it's very complicated. It is very complicated at the technical level too, because then if you say we exclude undemocratic countries, the question comes up, okay, what is an undemocratic country? How would you operationalize the definition of democracy in this context? Who decides, right? Who decides about this? And this is all very, very complicated and difficult, and there is no clear solution. So we think universality trumps the idea of democracy, but this solution only applies to the first stage of the process I mentioned, right? As long as the assembly is consultative, if we move this assembly towards a real parliament that can make law, you know, sometime in the future, who knows, then definitely it needs to be based on democratic legitimacy. And then definitely we will have to wait for a scenario where the majority of the people are elected to this assembly by clear, clearly free and fair elections.
I think that's a good point. Thank you. Hammering out that it's a process. This isn't something that will come about in the blink of an eye. And so that sort of in-between space is a matter of fact when we're dealing with the entire world and governing within that. I really like this question. This question comes from Matthew Equitis in the chat. Supposing this body is created, would it still not be hampered by the veto of the Security Council? Or does this vision suppose that the Security Council gives up their veto power?
Well, here too, we have to look at the different potential stages of implementation of the proposal. So let's start with the most pragmatic and realistic one, which means, I'm not sure I spelled it out in the initial presentation, but the UN General Assembly would apply Article 22 of the UN Charter and establish the Parliamentary Assembly. No charter change would be required, no involvement of the Security Council formally required. Right. So the General Assembly could do it right now. No veto would apply. But then, of course, we would have this double system of the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly, and the Security Council would still exist as it is right now, including the veto and everything else. So for sure, at this stage, that would not be a game changer in this regard. But I would argue that adding a Parliamentary Assembly to the General Assembly strengthens the General Assembly's legitimacy vis-a-vis the Security Council too. Right, so in practice, the veto and so on continues to exist, but the let's say the counterbalance by the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly would be much stronger, and it would have unprecedented legitimacy, whatever they decide. And also, you know, that there was the Liechtenstein initiative after Russia's veto on February 25th, which means that the General Assembly needs to address any veto that was cast in the plenary. So a Parliamentary Assembly then could also open up a spectrum of more voices and opinions being raised in connection with veto and so on, and perhaps over time create a new political dynamics. And, you know, one example is look at the stance that the South African government has taken vis-a-vis Ukraine. They are saying they are neutral, you know, they're just now you know, they have naval military exercises with Russia just now at the Cape. The thing is that this is not a unanimous view in South Africa. The official opposition strongly, is against not condemning the Russian aggression on Ukraine in the strongest terms on the part of the South African government. And in a Parliamentary Assembly, this view could be voiced because the official opposition would have a seat. Well, and then I'm finished with this, but if we look then at later stages in the process, I believe that in the long run, the Security Council should be abolished completely. The whole idea that there is this great power body, you know, with veto right that is running everything and taking binding decisions, that is anachronistic and outdated. I would stick personally, you know, that's just my personal opinion, but I would stick to the idea of having a parliamentary two-chamber system in the center of a new UN. And this two-chamber system would, for instance, create a joint security committee that looks at immediate and takes immediate decisions that are necessary, and which means we would have state representatives, but also parliamentary representatives in this committee. And the whole idea that there is a Security Council of great powers, and everything else is just submitting to it. That is, I think, something we need to overcome. But of course, this is this is just, wishful thinking at this stage. It's very difficult to imagine how to get rid of the veto, because getting rid of the veto itself is subject to the veto. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's an ever-present reminder that the victors of the Second World War they wrote the rules of the game for everyone else. I was going to ask a question, but that makes me want to field another one from the chat that was quite good, talking about enforcement powers. Here we are. The economic institutions like the WTO, IMF, World Bank, etc. These all have enforcement powers. How do we create enforcement powers for a parliamentary assembly, or even existing bodies like UNEP, UNICEF, and other organizations that advocate for human rights, or the international courts? What would those enforcement mechanisms look like?
Well, this is addressing, I believe, the system further down the road. Enforcement traditionally, as you know, in interstate affairs was sanctioning states as a collective. The international financial institutions, I'm not sure what enforcement power is referred to, but of course, one is that they simply would not make further loans, right? And a country might default, but that's not a direct enforcement. It's a consequence of not abiding by agreements with them. Nonetheless, I think that enforcement eventually is based on a new understanding of global society. That's exactly what the UNPA addresses. For instance, if you imagine in the Canadian domestic context, if somebody does not abide by federal rules, what do you do? I mean, in the end, it depends on what rules are being enforced, but you will eventually depend on police enforcement, I think, that is addressed against a certain individual or group of individuals. And that's also what I would envision happens at a global stage, at the later stage of, in fact, a global polity, a world federation, if you like, that is based on this understanding. For sure, enforcement cannot be achieved militarily. I think that is not a viable idea. But the precondition is, of course, that there is a very broad agreement on global constitutional rules, where majorities are actually willing to abide by them and willing to accept that if this not happens, that there is global police enforcement.
So might the UNPA give legitimacy to other ideas such as United Nations Emergency Peace Service? Or do you think that is the opposite of what would help us in this regard?
You know, my thinking is rather simple, I think, because I envision it really also globally as a system of checks and balances, where we have the three branches of government, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branch, which have a system of checks and balances in between. Well, and the UN Peace Service belongs to the executive. And for sure, I believe that a parliamentary assembly would strengthen the case, because it would strengthen the decision-making mechanism on which the use of a UN peacekeeping, troop could be based. The legitimacy would be just much greater. And I would also argue that the Parliamentary Assembly would have to be involved in such decision-making. And also it adds a level of oversight and accountability, in addition to the judiciary, which we didn't speak about, but it would make, I think, such an emergency peace service much more viable, yes. But of course, I mean, the problem is, I still think we shouldn't wait for a parliamentary assembly to be implemented. We can push the peace service in parallel. So we shouldn't make it dependent on it, but for sure make it clear that that it is an important mechanism of supervision and accountability.
Thank you. I want to bring the next question from the chat again, from Giovanni. How would this movement be financed? How could it be financed?
That's the movement for UN Parliamentary Assembly.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, of course, I have been coordinating the international work for UN Parliamentary Assembly for a long time, but still, I don't think it is a top-down matter. It is really depending on grassroots support, as I tried to indicate it. So I don't think that the question is really about funding a center that is running this, which is important. I mean, we need this, but I guess that we should rather look at it, how can we spark and mobilize at the grassroots level? That's making much more of a difference than I or somebody else from the Global Secretariat talking to UN ambassadors, right? We need both. I mean, global advocacy needs to be financed and needs to take place, but it will only be successful if we have that grassroots push.
I agree wholeheartedly. I'd like to bring the next question back to our guests in the Zoom call. So John Vlasto, I see you have your hand up. Please share with us your question.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm joining the call from London. I'm a disciple of Andreas. I've been working in this field about 5 years, and I started with Andreas, and I still work with Democracy Without Borders in the UK. And for my sins, I also chair the World Federalist Movement, which, as you probably all know, is the umbrella organization for World Federalist movements organizations around the world, including WFMC and Democracy Without Borders. And financing is one of the things I've been looking at. And I'm going to share a provocation here for this audience.
Alert from low battery.
I've been looking at this across the movement. And as a point of information, all of us struggle with financing. WFM in Canada is quite well financed compared to most of us. And
meeting is being recorded.
CGS in the US is, I think, the best funded World Federalist organization in the world at the moment. And the major source of their funds and a source of funds for Andreas and for WFM in recent years has been legacies. And I can see this audience is young at heart, but as a provocation, I just leave that thought with everyone when you're thinking about how this gets financed.
Thank you. Yeah, it is certainly people deeply dedicated to the movement that keep us going in our work. I want to move it to the concept of grassroots organizations again, because that was one of my questions I had prepared, was how do grassroots organizations play a role, but also how can everyday citizens advocate for a UNPA getting involved? How do you find a network? If you can elaborate on that, I think there'd be some interested ears in the chat.
Yes, thank you also, John, for that remark. I'm really happy to see you, and I'm mostly holding back on the financing issue, but it is true. I mean, financing is one of the key challenges, which is connected also to the political obstacles we are facing. Nonetheless, well, what can you do as an individual, and how can we build a mass movement? That's, of course, that's the holy grail we are looking for, right? That we are trying to find. And at the individual level, you know, what you can do is, for instance, well, if you can afford it, since we talked about funding, you can make a donation, which is nice. But you can also take action yourself. You have already taken action, you know, many of you, by joining the World Federalist Movement of Canada and the Toronto branch. So you are already part, I mean, you are part of the movement already. But you can also do more, like you can talk to your local MP, your member of parliament, and advocate that they sign on to the We the People's campaign or the UN Parliamentary Assembly campaign. Talk to them, you know, that they should bring it up in their party, in their political committees, in the parliament. You know, at the you as a constituent, you have, you know, I think their ear, and multiplying this, I believe, might help them realize that their voters care about it. But also what we certainly need is visibility in the media, which is also something that comes, I believe, bottom up, right? Our global secretariat cannot spark media intention in Canada, but perhaps, you know, you can write letters to the editor, but perhaps you also know people. You might be part of different organizations and raise it there. We are making the case really that the UN Parliamentary Assembly is a tool that is actually potentially useful in all sorts of fields, right? So in the environment, in the field of disarmament, addressing inequality and other things. So even NGOs, other NGOs that have a different mandate on such things, it is possible to argue, look, here is a proposal that can potentially help move forward your own causes as well, were it created. And what if I may, I find it quite paradox and ironic that we have here a global civil society campaign that that needs to advocate to parliamentarians that those parliamentarians should have more power internationally. And often those parliamentarians will tell us, well, we don't need this, right? So it's paradox. To me, it's quite crazy. But that was just a diversion. And the mass movement, there are environmental movements already. So in my thinking, it is not necessarily the case that we ourselves need to build a new mass movement, but it would already be a big achievement if we were to sensitize existing movements of the, usefulness of reforming global governance in general and creating a UN Parliamentary Assembly specifically. I don't know how helpful this was. There are many experienced campaigners in this virtual room, and of course, we can hear from them as well.
I think you make a good point about the sort of connected, interrelated movements and what brings people together. I know when the WFM Canada rebranded, we realized that people were brought to the movement through very connected but niche issues, and that we were able to expand beyond people who had a finer understanding of these institutions like yourself, and move to people who just had a sense of environmental justice, and the movement was sort of been able to expand in that sense. And I hope that's what gives it a second new life, and we can encourage those organizations to also advocate for a UNPA that can put that voice on the global stage. Sort of connected, how could a UNPA give minorities and Indigenous people a voice, whether at that grassroots level or on the international stage in negotiations?
Well, so institutionally, I think, first of all, if we open, it depends on the allocation of seats. So in very large countries like India, I believe that automatically by including, the possibility of electing, I don't have the exact figure in mind, but it's 100 or 120 delegates then, or representatives from India, that automatically through party lists and proportional representation, there would be a diverse group of MPs joining from India. Nonetheless, that will not be sufficient. There are many small countries that will have only a very small number of seats. And it is our proposal that UN Parliamentary Assembly should be built on a core membership of elected representatives, as I explained it. However, there is also a need, and this question addressed it, that particular stakeholders, or major groups as they are called in the UN, have a specific and clear representation. And we suggest that a number of extra seats should be added to the Parliamentary Assembly that are then taken by representatives of such groups. One would have to discuss in each case how the process and the method looks like. Indigenous peoples, for instance, there are, I don't know, over 10,000 potentially that, exist. And how do we then determine if there are, for instance, 5 extra seats for this particular group, by whom they are taken? But I think what counts is the principle here, that they then having those seats can participate as full members in the procedures of the assembly, even if they have not been elected through some party list in some country.
This is a comment made by Antonio Guterres on last year's UN Day, was that the UN is being tested like never before, facing a lot of crises. And this is something you've brought up. We've talked about the pandemic, the crisis in Ukraine. But he also goes on to say, but the United Nations was made for moments like this. But is it? Is the organization able to adapt in the face of these crises? We've talked about how we failed to mobilize citizens to have a more planetary consciousness. In your mind, what moves people towards that planetary consciousness? And do you believe the UN equipped for such changing reforms, such fundamentally a reform like the UNPA?
I think the development and creation of identity and loyalties is a very complex matter. It is interesting to see that according to surveys that have been carried out over the last years and even decades, many people already now, vast majorities actually already now, identify themselves as global citizens, mostly in addition to their national citizenship. So I would argue that in many cases, this is already the case, that there is an emerging planetary consciousness. The problem I see here is that this is not materializing in the political institutional structures that we have. And I see an interrelationship between the creation, the emergence of an identity and the emergence of institutions. The development of European institutions is a case that can be looked at, where successively the creation, of the European Parliament, the direct election of the European Parliament, then as a big milestone, the creation of a common European currency, free movement. These things have massively contributed in the younger generation, specifically to a European consciousness and identity. And this identity might have existed before, but it is now institutionalized and is insofar stable. It has been stabilized. And in the global sphere, such stabilization of identity is facing the political obstacle, really. And for me too, I have to admit, it is kind of unclear why this planetary consciousness that is visible in many serious surveys is not materializing in elections or elsewhere. Quite the contrary, what we can see is really, or at least that was the case until very recently, quite the contrary, we can see a nationalist movement, in many countries. So I have to admit, I don't know an answer to this question, really. However, one more thing, of course, needs to be said, and that is education, which is a long-term project, but global citizenship education in schools is a key element, for sure, that needs to be pushed forward, but that has only long-term effects. Democracy Without Borders, for instance, as an organization, is also trying to identify projects in this field. And now, really, the last remark, I believe the UN indeed can help create a global consciousness through its existence and through the vision that it, after all, does represent, right? The world coming together and solving its issues together with, there are all these failures and problems structurally, but still many people do trust in the UN more than they do in their own national governments, which you can also see in many international surveys that are being carried out regularly. And Erich Fromm, a psychoanalyst, he said that it would be an improvement if it was possible to channel people's narcissism towards the UN instead of towards their nation state. So that even in today's form, that would be an advancement. But it has been said, and that is true, that of course, with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, a war of annexation, the UN's public image is also under attack, so to speak. Trust into the UN is decreasing. Just the other week, the Edelman Trust Report was published for this year, and it shows a decrease in trust into the UN across the board in most countries. And I mean, not much, but it is quite remarkable. And I think this certainly also has to do with the fact that people recognize that the UN is, looking on without the ability to do anything substantial about this.
I think that's a good point. A lot of nationalist movements are taking the stage and obscuring sort of what the UN could be. This question comes from Rick Orser. It's also from the chat. The European Parliament has been, the European Parliament has endorsed the call for a UNPA. Have any European states also endorsed and supported a vote for it within the UNGA?
Well, it depends. Define what does it mean, a state support. So if that means a cabinet decision, right? The cabinet, the government officially decides they support this. This has happened only one time in the entire history of humanity, and that was ironically in 1919, when the German emperor was removed by the first democratic German government. And of course, that is history. So I'm not aware of any cabinet decision anywhere on that subject. Well, at the level of personal favors, or how would you say, personal support, it has happened that the foreign minister of Malta, George Vella, at the time, he supported it. At a personal level, Federica Mogherini supported it, but there is no government supporting it yet. The Swiss government for a while was sympathetic, but it has changed also, repeatedly since then, and no longer does so at this time. Well, so at this stage, well, the simple answer is no.
What about less formal support? If you want to talk about more general support from people you feel have helped advocate for the UNPA in less formal settings is okay as well.
Well, parliamentarians often are very supportive. Obviously, we've collected by over time the number of 1,700 who endorsed. Douglas Roach, who's right here, was one of them early on who signed up. Thank you, Douglas, for that. So no, honestly, it made a difference at the time. So many parliamentarians, they immediately grasp what this is about. Many don't. I mentioned that before, but many do. So that is an important group of stakeholders. But the challenge is how to transform that into government support, because eventually you are dealing then with the bureaucracy. Other groups that have supported it is civil society networks and groups, particularly from the World Federalist family, obviously, that's no surprise. Well, with the We the People's campaign, we really managed to make a step forward and bring in groups that previously were rather skeptic. And I just wanted to make one more remark. I mean, we see all these trends that appear to go into the wrong direction, but it might also help spark a stronger recognition that this cannot go on unchanged, right? That something needs to be done, and this could happen at the UN too over time. I mean, the Summit of the Future is one thing I mentioned. I don't think it will bring about anything substantial in our field, but it is still an opportunity to build momentum in civil society and with parliamentarians primarily.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree. A lot of people we've even had support. We had Justin Trudeau advocate for the World Federalist Movement, but then you get to certain levels of power and rocking the boat is a little bit more challenging. This question comes pre-prepared by the Toronto branch. If you are familiar with the Earth Constitution and Parliament Association, do you see any similarities between the Parliament Association and the UNPA?
Well, the UNPA is a proposed new body, and the parliamentary, what's the exact name? World Parliamentary and Constitutional Association, that's an NGO. So that's a difference I see, of course, immediately. So nonetheless, the World Parliamentary and Constitutional Association, as I understand it, does promote global democracy and a global parliament. So from that starting point, there appears to be common ground.
Okay, so if you see similarities, would you be amenable to participating in a joint Zoom meeting with Glenn Martin to explore the areas where the two could collaborate or cooperate?
Exploring collaboration is never a bad thing, I would say. So yes, why not? I would also remark that I'm aware of the constitution that they are promoting, and it would be an interesting discussion because personally, I would question some of the elements that they have put in there.
I think a lot of again, world federalism, your necessary solution for getting there can be very different, and it's what makes me want to keep showing up here and seeing all the wonderful questions that everybody puts in the chat, because we have a lot of different ideas for what those solutions might look like. John Vlasto has put another question here in the chat. What do you think of Article 109 for the Summit of the Future, as advocated by Augusto Lopez Carlos, among others? Claros.
Thank you, John, for this. Well, first of all, is everybody aware of what Article 109 means? We are a group of world federalists primarily, I think, so perhaps yes. Well, difficult in a Zoom meeting to see what people think. Well, so first of all, Article 109 is that provision in the UN Charter for a charter review, which was supposed to happen by 1955, and it never happened. So a charter review conference based on this can be called by a majority vote of the General Assembly and a majority vote of the Security Council. But the outcomes of any such review conference still need to be ratified according to 108, and which means including all two-thirds majority of the member states and the P5. So that's just so we are all on common ground, what that means. And it is true that some are saying I mean, the broader movement for global governance reforms, we should introduce the idea of a charter review conference into the process of the Summit of the Future. I think that in principle, Article 109 is the magic tool we have to actually start a global constitutional process. And that's one more thing I wanted to say about the Earth Constitution in different ways. I believe the process arriving at some constitutional draft might be even more important than the draft itself. And that's one of the things which I would say about the World Parliamentary and Constitutional Association. They have a finished draft, which they believe is perfect, as far as I understand. But what we really need is a broad, long, inclusive process that brings in all sorts of stakeholders and players, including governments, of course, to arrive at such a document. And I think the constitution they produced is an inspiration, and that should be taken into consideration. But I mean, nobody can think it's the final word. So I don't think that the Summit of the Future will touch Article 109. And it is also the question whether it is strategically smart to bring it up now, in my opinion, because it is a distraction from other lower hanging fruits. I mean, what some of the proponents are saying is that the Summit of the Future should not itself be a review conference, but should discuss the matter. right? So it then depends on the details of what that means. I certainly don't think it would be harmful if the governments would discuss the need of charter reform, right? So I think that would be good. But if it distracts them from touching things like the proposals of the We the People's campaign, I don't think it would be good, because they would then, use that as an excuse. So it really depends on how exactly this is framed and done.
Thank you for that response. This will be the final question from the Q&A. Could a treaty proposal help build support for a UNPA within the existing UN structure?
I need clarification on what treaty proposal means in this connection.
It's sort of left broad.
Mm-hmm.
You could also elaborate, is there ways within the UN structure that could help build support for the UNPA?
Okay,
not
okay.
necessarily be a treaty proposal, but if it is, what would that look like?
I think I get it now. Yes, it is true that there are different ways how a UNPA could be created legally, and one of which is by a standalone international treaty, and that's probably what is meant here in this question, as opposed to the other option I briefly touched on, the Article 22 UN General Assembly resolution. So, well, I think that the treaty approach eventually leads to the same obstacles. We still need to convince governments, and if it is an exclusive club of self-appointed democratic governments, we don't achieve universality. So it is questionable whether such an assembly can legitimately address global challenges. It essentially would be a club of perceived democratic countries, or maybe even, others. And eventually, if it were to have influence over the UN, again, in the end, there would have to be a UN General Assembly decision on how this treaty body relates to the UN, right? So I don't think, I know that the International Criminal Court, of course, as a treaty body, is one of the models and examples to draw upon. And I think it is always important to continue investigate this. So it's not set in stone, but at this point, I haven't heard good arguments how this is really an analogy, because we are trying to achieve different things. The one thing is a criminal court with individual accountability, and the other thing is the idea of a global parliamentary assembly, right? So legally it might be similar, but what we want to achieve politically is quite different. So, well, and if we eventually need a General Assembly resolution to bring in the treaty body into the UN, we can also start with a General Assembly right away. Why, take that detour? It's not immediately clear to me what the benefits would be. Oh, yes, because, one more thing, I think it's important that this body from the beginning has a connection to the existing structures. It could, even as a subsidiary body of the UN General Assembly, it could have a watchdog function, for instance, which I think is important, provide oversight. And if it's unconnected to anything, like, for instance, the Latin American Parliament is, it's kind of, it's flying in the sky and doesn't achieve much except symbolic, at best, symbolic decisions, which are not identified as representing global opinion.
There's actually one more question from the chat. I think this will be our last one, truly, because we have 3 minutes, but it's also from Rick Orser. Has any progress been made with the IPU on endorsing the call for a UNPA, now that civil society and many others are endorsing it?
Oh, thank you, Rick, and happy to see you. I don't actually see you right now on screen, but see you virtually, and for putting forward this question. Well, the Interparliamentary Union is, of course, let's say, as the umbrella organization of national parliaments, potentially in a position to have a pioneering role in pushing forward this idea of a global parliament and global democracy, but Rick, unfortunately, they are not. So it is still the case that the IPU perceives the UNPA proposal, that's my interpretation, as a potential, if it were established, a potential competition and a body that would potentially undermine their role, which is a fallacy and simply not correct. But that is their perception, and that's unfortunate. We, as you know, we would like the IPU to play a positive role and recognize that in a future system they are still needed, no matter that the UNPA is playing this role at the UN.
Andreas, I want to thank you so much. I've never seen a Q&A quite so bustling, so I think your ideas resonate with a lot of people. I'm going to throw it over to John Cowan now. Oh, you're on mute, John. Let the people hear you.
Thank you, Erica, for asking all those questions. And Andreas, the list of questions is evidence of the extreme interest you've generated here. I was always interested in this idea and why we wanted to have you here, but you've now given me so many more things to put in my one-page summary. I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. So many great insights that I'm sure we will be living with and trying to work on and with your campaign over the next little while. And although the official question and answer time with you is now over, and we're happy to let you go, I'm going to throw the floor open to members to give us, who are on the call from the Toronto board, suggestions of what we, the Toronto board, might do to facilitate your campaign. So again, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and stick around and watch the fur fly now as we open up the floor to anybody and everybody who wants to raise their hand at this point, not to ask a question of Andreas, that's out of order. Although Andreas, you can answer if you wish, but to make suggestions of what the Toronto board should be doing or could be doing to help facilitate the UNPA campaign. And I've just put in the chat the website address for the World Federalist Movement Canada, and seeking your support. But so I'm going to take your spotlight off Andreas and even off me, so that we can, if I can figure out how to do that.
Just a final word, if you allow. I would like to thank you again so much for the invitation and your interest. And WFM Canada has always been a strong supporter of the UNPA, even long before the UNPA campaign existed, with Dieter Heinrich's paper in 1990. So I really appreciate this. I will hang on for a few minutes, but then I will, silently disappear. And thank you very much again.
Fine, thank you, Andreas. Norbert, I don't know if you want to field this part of it as chair of the board.
No,
or
go ahead, John. You can continue.
Okay,
please.
well, I see a hand from Matthew. Oh, no, he just took his hand down. If you want to make suggestions of what the Toronto board should do in this regard, please raise your hand and let us know what you think.
There was a question or something from Keith McNeil. Perhaps you want to, Keith, would you like to speak up?
Keith.
Hello. Yeah. Am I on?
Yes,
Yes.
you are.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mentioned in my comment, I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby Canada, in addition to World Federalist Movement. And so Citizen Climate Lobby has their goal is to implement carbon fee and dividend. It's like a carbon tax, but instead of the money going into general revenue, the money is distributed as equal dividends to everyone, as similar to a universal basic income. And so They've had a fair amount of success. Canada's federal backstop carbon tax, which sees 90% of the money going back to households, is basically carbon fee and dividend. And we've been told by senior people in the Liberal government that it was because of our efforts that this came about. And so one of the tactics they use, kind of the central thing they do, is every year they have a conference in Ottawa, and the first couple of days are training, and then the second couple of days are people go out and meet with their MPs and senators and senior public officials and try and sell them on the idea. And I'm thinking perhaps that's a strategy or tactic that we could use. I'm thinking particularly with this interparliamentary union, that might be something that we could work on. Find out which MPs are members of the IPU, and then go and talk to them and try and swing their thinking to what we believe in.
Okay, that interesting thought. Yes, we've certainly thought about a conference in Ottawa of some sort, and as you're suggesting now, the Interparliamentary Union, and get in the midst of the fur flying on that banner, maybe. Thank you. Other suggestions of what the Toronto branch might do?
Rose, do you have a question?
You're muted, Rose.
I'm not sure that my question is specifically for the Toronto branch, but something that occurred to me while Andreas was still speaking was his mention a couple of times of the We the People movement or campaign that seems to be injecting some new blood into the organization or the Initiative for a World UNPA, and that previously skeptical groups like Greenpeace and I've forgotten the name of the other one are involved, and that's good, I think, in his view, but that they are not offering much in the way of how the national governance can be reformed. And I can't help thinking of something that came through recently into my email box, and probably that of a few others, because he was a speaker for us at one time, Guy Dancy, and what Al Gore had to say at the World Economic Forum recently about the fact that progress is not being made fast enough in addressing the climate crisis. So I can't help thinking that with any kind of parliamentary reform within the UN, that has to assume a much higher profile than it has in the past. And I mean, Guy Dancy seems concerned about it, and he's asking for comments, but is there anything we could do at the local level to push that along?
Well, that was the question for you, Rose.
Well, I suppose Keith is what he's proposing or doing is a step in the right direction. But how do we accelerate that? Al Gore says that the World Bank and the Economic Forum are failing. The next COP is going to be led or hosted by an oil-rich company in the Middle East or country in the Middle East. I mean, many environmental groups are very skeptical, or climate change activists on what's happening. So how shouldn't we be paying a little more attention to these developments?
Okay, well, maybe John Vlasto, your comment relates to that or something else?
No, it does relate to that if you'd like to hear it.
Yes, please.
Andreas, I don't know if you're still on the call, if you'd like to say anything. I'll carry on.
I gave him a bye.
Oh yeah, I know you gave him a bye, but I mean, I was going to talk about the mega project, Andreas. I don't know if you want to say anything first or.
No, please go ahead. That's fine.
Okay, so I am working on an environment project. I'm a World Federalist. I work closely with Andreas. I also shared Rose's view that we should be focused on the environment, because in my thinking, that's the most, I think we need a catalyst, is my thinking. And I think environment is the most likely catalyst, and it needn't be so catastrophic. There's nothing left. It's unpredictable, but there's something to play for here. So I am working with a colleague, far more experienced than myself, an international treaty lawyer, on an environmental governance project. And so part of that team, she's well connected, having been doing this a long time, working with Johan Rockström, who's a planetary boundary scientist, and then some of the great and the good in the sort of progressive world, like Maria Fernanda-Espinosa, Mary Robinson, and others, with an idea of putting together effective and accountable global governance of the environment in an integrated way. I know Johan Rockström's working on an integrated, like an IPCC for the planet as a whole, rather than just climate. So there are complementary projects moving forward on the science and on the governance, and very much part of the governance side of the environment is having a parliamentary body, because if you're going to have effective governance, it needs to be held accountable, and you're rapidly into needing a parliament. And a huge part of any transition to post-carbon economy, etc., is a just transition. And again, how do we achieve justice if we're not talking to each other on a fair basis? And again, you're into deliberation in parliamentary bodies. So actually, when Keith made his comment in the questions, I forwarded him a concept note for this project. So there is work going on complementary to Andreas's, with more of an environmental focus.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. I have my ear stuck into that tent, and we'll be on the call tomorrow with you, but it raises, it inspires me to comment about, well, a governance system for the environment is about 99% of a governance system for everything else too. So I'm thrilled to see an effort to coordinate the efforts of many people to encourage the development of better global governance, and UNPA is part of that, I'm hearing. Great.
Yeah, Maria Fernanda-João, who's president of the one of the European think tanks, is a part of this group, and she repeatedly makes the point that all of these governance issues are interrelated, and one needs to be able to deal with all of them. So absolutely, that's part of our thinking.
Thank you. Fiona, you've suggestions for what the Toronto board should do here?
I'm not sure if this constitutes a suggestion. Well, maybe it does. Forgive me if I am totally speaking out of turn here, because I am relatively new to the World Federalists, although my parents were World Federalists before me. I've recently been drawn attention to the fact that it is the 50th anniversary of the publication of E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. And that there is a series of monthly lectures from the Schumacher Center on Schumacher's ideas, and all, featuring people who have taken them up and explored new possibilities. And while I entirely agree that the environment, climate change is the overriding concern of all of us, rereading Schumacher really leads me to think that the reason we're not getting anywhere fast enough, either with a push towards some sort of participatory global governance model, or really on facing the serious problems that we have, has to do with the fact that we are dealing with this 19th century economic model, which won't face things like the limits to growth. And I was just wondering if there was any point in putting this into the mix.
A good suggestion. It's certainly a foundation of our environmental problems, our consumption problems, and our economic system. I think Peter Venton or John Venton would comment that way. Peter, Norbert, I see your hand up, but Peter, who's named John Venton on this slide, should comment on that.
Andreas, I just want to say at the outset, this has just been an awesome presentation. At one point, and this is what I think the Toronto branch should be doing, but I think on one point, Andreas mentioned citizen education in or education in global citizenship. I think we should expand that to national education as a stepping stone to citizenship in this country, because we don't have that, and we essentially are in the back pockets of the corporate sector and the neoliberal capitalist system, which has now been defined as essentially broke, and that needs reform. But I don't know if there's anything in your education system or their education of global citizenship. Is there a formal text or curriculum or information of that sort? Because I would be interested in seeing that.
John Vlasto, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, I just encourage you guys to reach out to WFM if you have questions like that, because there's a whole bunch of new videos that were released, and Andreas has just, Democracy Without Borders, just published the book behind those videos. Yeah. So there are materials out there, so just get in touch with WFM.
And I would like to get the book. I didn't quite get the information on it from Andreas, but that's in the recording, John.
Yeah, and it's in the chat as well, and it's also on the Democracy Without Borders website, which will link, I suspect, to all the videos that were produced as well.
I will summarize that in the summary. Norbert, you've had your hand up longer.
No, I just wanted to say that if anybody is new to world federalism and would like to ask questions as to what world federalism is or anything about the WFMC, please feel free to ask the questions as well.
Erica, you had a suggestion?
I wanted to comment first that in addition to the book, there is the One World video lecture series. That's all on YouTube. It's 17 parts. I think it's a really important contribution to the cause. It's highly academic, and I think it touches on so many issues with the foundations of our world and the barriers that prevent people from even beginning to think of things outside their basic needs, and to larger things like the structural problems. I feel like I'm more reminded this year in 2023 that our system was sort of the byproduct of feudalism. Maybe it's rising rent costs and food and all this, but maybe all this talk about landlords, you start to realize sort of what you're saying, and it's really hard to, I think that's the way we bring it to more everyday people, because the reason we're in this shock and unable to move stems a lot from the fact that there are a lot of structures in place to keep us very paralyzed. So we're always thinking about paying our next bill. And I do see our next sort of advocacy route as going through more of these sort of social justice and understanding that there are barriers to people being able to participate in discussions like this, because you just can't get that far in your thinking. I actually can't remember my initial reason for putting up my hand. I think in response to, I know Peter has I went to your Peter Benton's talk on the economy, which delves into a lot of things I'm very deeply passionate about, and speaks to sort of very top-down structures of why things are the way they are. But if anyone else has an avenue, ideas for helping us access new audiences, I think the One World video lecture series, I can't recommend it enough, as someone has gone through it.
Can you give us a link? Can you tell us a link for it?
Mm-hmm.
Put it in the chat or something.
Yeah.
So any other suggestions? If not, I think it's probably time to, John.
I'll just say that's exactly the videos I was talking about. So you guys are ahead of me. Great.
Okay. Very good.
Okay.
Great. We'll propagate that news. So I want to remind everybody, although maybe most of the people here know that we're a member-run organization, and it's easy to join by going to the wfmcanada.org website. I put that link in the chat. Any and all donations are welcome, as well as support. volunteer support. We can always use help, and especially on the UNPA campaign that we are trying to figure out exactly what our slice of that is to support Andreas and what he's up to. And it's easy to join, easy, especially if you're under age 30 or a student. It's free, completely free. So your participation with time or your donation is you helping give the people a voice in global governance. So we encourage your participation. I'll be preparing maybe a one-page summary. It may end up being two based on everything that was said today, and sending a note around to everybody who's registered for this event with that summary and a link to the recording in case you're interested. And if anybody wants to talk further about what the World Federalist Movement is, because you're not familiar with it, please stay on as we wrap up now, but we're happy to keep talking about what the World Federalist Movement is. And we thank particularly John Vlasto for showing up to help us here today.
I was about to say thank you very much for letting me crash your meeting. So thank you. That was a great meeting. I enjoyed it.
Good, thank you.